just to start and to enter into context, a few years ago, and with much effort, the fact that the movement in defense of animals is mostly made up by women, and that at the same time, the positions of greater visibility and power were mostly occupied by men, was collectively put on the table or made visible, right? So there were also uncovered cases of predatory behavior and sexist violence that were totally unacceptable. And different types of responses were given and a lot of commotion was caused. How do you see these issues today?
Well, it's very discouraging. So starting off with this question, perhaps it helps us name where we are, but it is very discouraging. And I'll just say, Sexual Politics of Meat came out in 1990. That year, I was invited to address the leadership of the animal rights movement, which at that point would get together once or twice a year to talk about different strategic things. So all the members of big and medium-sized groups got together. And I was invited to speak to them about feminism and animal rights and misogyny and the movement. And that was in 1991. So I wrote to several women in the movement who were in important positions. And what I heard back is exactly what we hear today. The men were getting all the credit, that the men were sexually harassing the women on the staff, and even one of the men who then went on to become very famously named in 2016 was already acting as though women were property for him to use back in 1991. I remember I reported this. I talked about the way misogyny works in the movement, the fetishism of leadership, how men were being made leaders, and how this reinforced the idea that men were experts, and this played into a culture that was already misogynist. And afterwards, Henry Spira, who a very delightful activist, wonderful, creative man. He came up with the campaign against the Museum of Natural History in New York City, in Manhattan, and Peter Singer actually wrote a biography of him. Anyway, Henry came up to me and he said, "What are you trying to do? Are you trying to destroy the movement?" But ever since then, I have talked with women in the movement and heard stories of sexual exploitation from women in the movement. And I began to suspect that there might be some men in the movement who really didn't care about animals, but they realized that here was a movement composed of three-quarter population of, was populated 75% by women. So there were, easy pickings from their point of view. And there's an interesting sort of sexist overlay here too. Catherine McKinnon talks about how hard it is for women to bond together over our own needs. Now, when I speak this way, I'm speaking of analyses that have come from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I know the gender binary is fluid, but I do think we should footnote and just say right from the beginning, the gender binary and the sexual politics of meat are constantly interacting and holding each other up. But in any case, that women, whoever defines themselves as women, coming together for their own cause was difficult. But here were women coming together for another cause, the cause of animals. In the 19th century, when women did this, it's not, one historian argued that they were seeing their own plight in the plight of animals. It wasn't that they saw intersection, but they saw representation or a symbolic. Anyway, here you have women who don't join the feminist movement, but join the animal rights movement. But the animal rights movement is looked down at by society because it's thought to be sentimental. It's equated with women's emotions. So when men come along, they're seen as sort of saving the movement because they speak rationally. Men are already, especially white, middle class, cisgender men are seen as authorities. So many women were grateful that men came in. Other women thought they could trust these men because if a man cares about animals, they've got to be good people or sympathetic. So this set up the movement for a variety of forms of sexual exploitation. Even though it doesn't really come out till 2016, I'd been hearing these stories since the book appeared in 1990. So where are we today? 3 of the men most identified, 2 publicly and 1 never named publicly, but was known to use the legal system to suppress information. All 3 of them are still involved in animal issues. So even though in 2017 and 2018, we did a concerted effort around Me Too and the animal rights movement, and if you look at the blogs on my blog page on my website, you'll see that I would often hand over the blog to someone who had experience of being sexually exploited or was an advocate. So I tried to use my visibility to keep this visible. And even though we named some, a lot were unnamed, and we never really were able to deal with the fact that sometimes it's volunteers sexually exploiting other volunteers. So you don't necessarily have a, you don't have the equivalent of, say, human resources to complain to. Yeah. And that one thing the movement did was it passed a couple of these men from place to place. So if they, cause too many issues in one place, well, they're bros, they're, brothers from different mothers, all the bro language they developed, that protect them by moving them to another organization. And so here's how we experience it today. The expertise they claimed for themselves through publication or speaking remains as expertise, even though some of it should be undercut because there were racist and sexist assumptions figuring into how they talked about veganism. We end up with a movement that can't figure out, is it more important to have someone who's seen as effective for the animals, even if they're a bad person, or even if, she said he did something, but they're so good for the animals. We ended up with an approach to animal rights that was very narrow. And that approach occurred in the 1990s as all of these, especially white men, entered the movement, energized and moved up. And they helped define that instead of, say, taking works like mine and works on ecofeminism and by the year 2000 and 2010, works by Breeze Harper and others, instead of taking that and saying, hey, we could go about doing this not by just focusing on animals, but by making the case for connections. No, they really created a very tight focus. We've got to stay focused on the animals. And as a result, as women tried to critique, say, the sexual exploitation or the emphasis on rationality, they were told, this isn't good for the animals. We should not have infighting. It's not good for the animals. So they kind of sealed themselves in to a place that to attack them was to attack the movement. And we're still recovering from that. So that's a long answer, but at the core of it is the misogyny that was inherent once the animal rights movement felt that it needed to speak only about animals, but it could not speak in a voice that was emotional or caring, because our Western culture sees caring as adolescent or childlike or female-like. If you look at the response to the March on Animals that happened in 1990, It was the first time there was a march on Washington, which, as you probably know, is a big political statement to have a march on Washington. And it's the first time it's done for animals. And afterwards, several people were quoted in the paper, women and men, saying, now we've shown them we're not just a group of little old ladies in sneakers. Well, you know, what does that tell us? Well, not just the misogyny, but the little old ladies were there first. I was 23 when I had the idea for the sexual politics of meat.
Mhm.
It is almost 50 years later. Do I want to be a little old lady in sneakers working for animals? No, but the movement hasn't helped in any way to, well, the movement, this specific,
Yeah.
you know, closed in
Yes.
movement hasn't helped in any way to recognize how change really happens. So that the change that they argued for was incremental, you know, larger cages. Even the men who were abolitionists went along with welfare decisions. It set back the movement, and millions of dollars later, what do we have? Some critiques have talked about the animal rights movement in going along with these welfare advocacy as a Stockholm syndrome, where suddenly the animal rights movement thought that they could work with the corporations and come out ahead. You know, so I have a lot of anger and a lot of grief for the lost opportunities, and also for the fact that men who said women lied are still in the movement, and the women aren't.
Yeah.
That we lost through sexual exploitation and the failure to handle it right.
Yeah.
Women leaders who could have moved the movement forward in a way that made more connections.
Yeah.
So, long answer to your question.
Also thinking about what you said regarding the all the violence that wasn't named and wasn't made explicit, and I was even thinking like the amount of violence that wasn't even detected because of this like lack of knowledge and lack of experience from a feminist point of view within the movement and in general in the society, but also like all the lost opportunities in that sense of not making these connections, as you said. But yeah, I don't want to be pessimistic.
I used to go to the animal rights, there was an annual animal rights conference, and whatever other feminists were there would invite, you know, women, anyone who identified as women to come and sit and talk with us. Usually it wasn't good, like till 11 o'clock at night that there was some free time. And what we heard was this confusion. And often there were many women who talked about the sexual assaults or sexual exploitation they experienced at the conference and elsewhere. And so when the organizer told me that my name brought in people being, you know, 75% women, I stopped going because I felt that I couldn't be responsible for the fact that, and 50% of the people every year were new people, that they would come to a conference where the result could be sexual exploitation. We haven't handled this because the animal rights movement hasn't handled the basic question: are we happy with society as it is, except that it eats animals and feminized protein, as I call it? Is that the only unhappiness we have with society? And when you look at who people are lifting up as leaders and the YouTube people, and, you know, they're all, so many of them participate in this angry white male posturing. But it's like, is this the only problem with the world as it is? No, it's not. Are we uniquely equipped to talk about animals? Perhaps we are, but to talk about animals without looking at the other cultural constructions that are benefiting from that and that also uphold it, we are always going to spin our wheels. because we're not even naming it correctly.
Exactly. Yeah, I couldn't agree more on your words. And it's very, yeah, like very exciting to listen to you, and also to kind of dimension all the experiences regarding sexism, misogyny, and so on within activist community. So you already started to answering this question, but I would like to ask you in a broad sense, how do you think feminisms and anti-speciesism enrich each other, and how do they complement each other, these two struggles, which in the end we know it's one struggle? But how would you say, for people who maybe is not familiar with your work, how would you summarize it?
The evolution of my work was always that I saw how I talked about the status of animals as arising from a feminist theoretical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll also just footnote here, there are some activists who say, oh, you go do theory, we've got to do activism. No, theory informs activism, and activism informs theory. I'm not an academic. I don't have a PhD. My theory evolved from my activism. But anyway, the feminist theory, and I'm not alone in developing it. And I feel like one of my roles after Sexual Politics of Meat was try to help make sure that others who were thinking these thoughts and writing about it were known. So I ended up editing several anthologies so that there was even more information out there. But the feminist theory I began to work on was that feminism is a movement that seeks for the amelioration of all creatures and the earth. And that feminist theory provides some understanding of why the other animals are so often excluded from concern, how they become absent from our minds, or how we create a very narrow sympathy for the animals who we may have in our household with us, who are usually animals who we would not eat. And in fact, because we, at least in the Western world, keep as pets dogs and cats, we actually create mirrors for our own omnivorousness in the animals, that the few animals that society says it's okay to care about. So I began to look at several things. One is that feminism resituates the idea of what rationality is. We look at Western philosophy, and the evolution of this idea of the rational man, the history of philosophy as being something that involves the mind and rationality, and that sympathy and compassion are emotions, and emotions are untrustworthy. And it's something I mentioned earlier, but this idea that the human in Western culture became equated with the white middle class man. That's who represented humanity, and in philosophy and in the world. And so the question in terms of feminism, it's not the claim that we have in the United States that feminism is the radical notion that women are human. A feminist like me is questioning, how do we define human? What is human? Human is so often defined as not animal, but we are animal. And where do we put women? Because human, which was equal to, white males, white men, what I talk about now in a new book is the rational economic man. He was someone who is differentiated from woman, and woman is pushed closer to the animal human border, or the non-animal human border. So then you look at, well, who is it that's seen as less than human or non-human, or for whom animality becomes part of their oppression? And in the United States, we know that occurs for people of color and women of all color. So we're pushed closer to animals. And so one of the thoughts I had was that the animal-human boundary is part of its role is to uphold the oppression of certain classes of humans. And so an anti-racist feminist theory will intervene there. The other thing that happens in this sort of fetishizing of rational economic man, the man of reason in Western philosophy, is that the distrust of emotions, as though the body is cut off from the mind, but the mind exists in the body. The mind isn't some extra thing outside there. The mind is influenced by the body as well. And so feminism isn't saying we shouldn't think, it's just widening how we think. That if we end up crying at the thought of something, that's information we need to pay attention to. If we're suppressing grief because we are so frightened to know what's actually happening to animals, that's information we have not become sophisticated enough in our living and thinking to understand and incorporate. So then I looked at how, the basic issues in sexual politics of meat, how manliness and masculinity and virility became associated with eating dead animals, especially four-legged animals, in Western culture, and the role especially of the United States in defining this sort of feed your man meat. Father's Day in the United States, you'll see ads like that. So it became that those who did not eat meat were seen as less than men. And I think it's happening less now, but only recently. The assumption was if you did not eat four-legged animals, you were gay if you were a man. So that, these stereotypes about homosexuality, it just collided, but was made to fit in with the sexual politics of meat. The other thing was that eating tofu, what could emasculate you? And the interesting thing here is how fragile masculinity turns out to be. If eating a meal of tofu, one meal, can undo your man card. You'll hear, it's not so much recently, but you'd have all these things, renew your man card, eat a hamburger. And I'd often say, my library card lasts for 3 years. Why does the man card expire after one meal of tofu? I mean, how fragile it is. Let's eat more tofu. But it's a mythology that is held on to. Did you see last summer in France, it was raised that men were eating too much meat, and this was, contributing to the environmental crisis. And this, this got coverage in the New York Times, where one of the ecofeminist legislators raised that. But, there's the sexual politics of meat in 2022, the same debate 32 years later. Like, I'm tired.
Yes.
When do we get to move beyond this hang up about masculinity? Finally, that the feminist analysis looks at oppression and how oppression is working. And the contribution here in sexual politics of meat was the concept of the absent referent, which I sort of wrenched from literary criticism and said animals are absent referent in meat eating. Animals disappear as beings with their own lives to becoming numbers or pounds or renamed as hamburger. So the animal disappears as a being who matters to themselves and others. And then I looked at, once you have this concept of the absent referent, you can see that in a misogynist culture, women are situated in this way. I mean, really, right now in the United States, with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, women's lives are the lives of anyone who can become pregnant are so are held so lowly that in order to please a minority, a loud minority, you're willing to risk their lives. I mean, that is a basic definition of a misogynist culture, that the lives of pregnant women and non-binary and pregnant, the men who can become pregnant, they are held so low that cast them aside, let them die, in service of patriarchal ethics. Anyway, the oppression of women and the oppression of animals then become linked.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll stop there because I don't think I know how to answer a short, think I know how to offer a short answer, but
I don't think it's easy to do it. And more with your trajectory and your work for all these years. I was thinking we also have a national example of this fragile masculinity saying publicly, like the president, when they were discussing about reducing, not even from an animal ethics point of view, but they were more centering in climate action and so on because of the climate crisis. And they were talking about how the population should reduce the consumption of other animals. And his comment was, what I like is to eat a stick or something like that. Just that. So
right.
You can see that men in power here, the sexual politics of meat is very exemplified, sadly. Yeah.
And you know what's interesting about it is, who are they eating? I mean, they're eating herbivores. They're not eating, you know, the results of some sort of primal battle of tooth and claw in the forest. They haven't you know, rendered a dangerous beast to the ground and triumphed with their own hands. I mean, all these notions of masculinity, what are they eating? They are eating placid herbivores who could not move or escape if they could. And this is considered something that contributes to masculinity. I mean, it's cowardice. Not that I want masculinity to be defined by courage, but this certainly is not courage, nor is it courage when you read these studies that men are afraid to eat tofu at lunch because they'll be judged by other men. I mean, like, isn't courage something to be valued? Isn't courage something that supposedly is part of manliness? I don't believe it, but I mean, those who believe that manliness is something out there believe that being courageous and brave is part of it, and they're not even brave enough to eat a tofu.
We would also like to question you about the concept of intersectionality, which in the recent years has gained momentum in the anti-speciesist movement. We know, of course, that it was born within Black feminisms, but we would like to know more about how is intersectionality related to speciesism, in your opinion, and if you think it is an important perspective to consider.
So, intersectionality, as you indicated, is a term associated with Kimberly Crenshaw from a 1989 law article about recognizing that, you know, women of color are being discriminated both by race and sex, and that it's combined. And she thought that this might actually help us recognize when sexual harassment is happening, because say for me, I might be called a CUNT, but a Black woman would be called a Black CUNT. And so the viciousness of adding sort of the color line to it might highlight how sexual harassment itself has happened. She's articulating this just before, this is what's so fascinating, just before the whole hearing about Clarence Thomas when he was nominated to the Supreme Court. And Anita Hill came forward and said she had been sexually exploited by him, sexually harassed. And so Crenshaw went on to discuss that, that specific example of intersectionality in an article that was in a book that Toni Morrison edited back in 1992 or 93. It came out. I think Crenshaw herself has been a little uneasy about how intersectionality has become kind of like the new thing, without a complete understanding. I know I used the word interconnected oppressions in 1990. I did not, my book was finished in the summer of 1989, so I did not have Crenshaw's article when the book went to press. I use the terms interconnected oppression, also overlapping oppression. Ecofeminism had been talking about these ideas of that how we look at the earth, the rape of the earth, is influenced by a patriarchal viewpoints, patriarchal perspectives. So Crenshaw's contribution is immense, but it's not separate from, for instance, the ecofeminist analysis. As I said earlier, the 1990s saw the animal rights movement choosing not to go that path, not to listen to the many voices that were providing an analysis that showed we can't be talking about animals without talking about race, sexuality, patriarchy, class. All of that is influencing how we think about animals. I don't know, I suspect it's probably after Breeze Harper's Sister Vegan appeared from Lantern Books, where you're getting the voices of women of color in the movement in a way that's easily obtainable. And then a kind of rediscovery of ecofeminism. In the 1990s, ecofeminism was thought to be essentialist. It was thought by us talking about dualisms about men and women that we believed in those dualisms. We did not. We were critiquing them. But it was an easy out to say that, they're just essentialists, and throw out all of ecofeminism. So by about 2010, 2011, there's a reclamation. In addition, one of the problems was that we end up with animal studies and critical animal studies, and there's a temptation to view works like mine or works like ecofeminists as structuralists and all. And so they were citing their influence as Derrida and post-structuralism. There's an interesting essay that came out that you all might want to link to. I think it's available now, that appeared in Critical Inquiry that sort of challenges the misogyny within the telling the story of critical animal studies by Susan Freeman. I'll send you a link. Anyway, you've now got this kind of conversation going on. Intersectionality becomes more apparent, or the issue of intersectionality becomes tied to the Black Lives Matter movement, which of course is more than 10 years old now. I mean, it's horrendous. How many African Americans have been killed by the police in these terribly violent ways that are irrational. And I think that brought more voices in. You have to remember that one of the problems for the animal rights movement was who would be interviewed by the newspapers. Whenever I was interviewed, I'd be interviewed by a British press or something, and they'd say, well, the vegan movement, it's mainly white. I said, well, it's only mainly white because that's who you're interviewing. Why aren't you interviewing people of color who are vegans? There's this person and there's this person. I mean, you are reinforcing this idea that it's whiteness in the movement. Yes, there are issues of whiteness in the movement, and I've talked about it, but the movement's not white. Why do you reinforce that? But as more voices came in, you've got groups like Food Empowerment Project, which is just this incredible project that is not just looking at animals, it's looking at, say, a chocolate and how it's harvested by really enslaved young people, looking at migrant workers in California. The voices of those who make the connections began to be heard more widely. And suddenly it became the thing to say you're an intersectional vegan. And who defined that? I mean, somebody was just trying to correct me on Twitter, and their Twitter handle is intersectional vegan, and yet, you know, they're kind of saying things that are not intersectional at all. It's as though this has become a free-floating referent that just seems hot or sexy or, you know, the thing to do without any understanding of what that means. So yes, I want the movement to have these kind of conversations, but the important thing is that there are times when we need to be in alliance with other activisms in which our veganism is perhaps quiet. There are times to be vocal and times to be quiet, and times to make connections and times simply to serve vegan food. And I think that has to do with a sort of vegan etiquette, but also a vegan theory that never loses sight that the status of animals we are consuming is related to these other structural oppressions.
Thank you.
Yes, we translated the book of Asancil Coe.
Right. Wonderful.
They talk about all of this and this. Yes.
Yes.
That one. And we are now working in the next one, the one of Af.
Right. Yeah. Great. No, I think this helped make a big difference. Afroism made a big difference because, like Breeze's book, Sister Vegan, it's out there. To have a book published is important. This is how, you know, some of the white men became experts, because they got published. Oh, they must know something. But here we've got these wonderful women, vegan women of color, who are kind of stretching our understanding and our theory and our activism and challenging the presumptions. I mean, Af began with her wonderful website about Black vegans, and Syl had been working philosophically for many years. So when you brought their voices together, you've got this sort of definitive approach that isn't trying to be definitive, and yet it is saying that we are really missing something when we don't recognize the role of white supremacy in animal oppression, and the role of white supremacy in creating the notion of who's an animal. I had marked something that I just love about them, you know, that Black veganism is a socio-political movement that rearticulates Black oppression through the lens of animality and race. It's so important. Black veganism is a methodological tool to reactivate our imaginations. Racism is simultaneously anti-Black and anti-animal. That's incredible. They have provided a sort of blueprint for understanding why intersection, as it's sort of been called, is so necessary.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you wrote the epilogue in the book.
Did.
Yeah, I thought it was amazing. Like, you summarized it very well, and also clarified, like, for white folks, you know, and this white mindset sometimes. I think it was so nice and so pedagogic. Also, your epilogue of the whole book. And yeah, I don't know, you already read some parts, but would you like to share with us what do you think is the most interesting contribution they make in the book? Or maybe you already answered this question.
Well, I mean, I do think the book itself is its statement that you begin with a book, Essays on Pop Culture, Feminism, and Black Veganism. Black veganism, which they then go on to define. And as I quoted, I just think those statements that they made were incredible. Here was Af, assuming animals are disposable is actually a product of being colonized by white supremacist patriarchy. And then she goes on to talk about that. I think one of the things that I tried to do was honor and lift up this incredible intervention that they offer and show everyone, but including whites who want to continually, or some whites who want to continually say, we are just talking about animals. We don't need to talk about that. And so that's why I did this chart. I kind of was very proud.
Yes, I love that chart. I for me, it's like, to share in a PowerPoint, and it's incredible.
I was looking for the Spanish edition, but I can't find it. I think I gave it to someone.
Well, I'm glad it's available in Spanish, and I was just honored and humbled to be a part of it, and thrilled to be invited to have a small word in it. But I did love coming up with.
I have found this one.
Okay.
So,
yes.
So Laura Taylor.
Good.
There's another one in Spanish. We published it.
I'm so glad you did. It's such a powerful book. Now we have these books that are coming out that are able to help us see, like Sanura's on disability and disability liberation and animal liberation. So powerful, because when she looks at issues of autonomy, how do we define autonomy? Well, the disability movement defines autonomy differently. Doesn't that help us when we think about animals? The way oppressions intersect and overlap. And, one of her incredible interventions, which is so powerful, is, everything's powerful, but the idea that animal agriculture actively disables animals. That in a sense, not only are people not eating, these carnivores that they've hunted, they're eating disabled animals. It's stunning.
And when you published The Sexual Politics of Meat, we imagine it was a controversial book that made many people uncomfortable, as you also mentioned before, both within feminist spaces and among people dedicated to animal defense. Years have gone by, and more people recognize the rightness of what you proposed on it. On the other hand, in today's activism, it seems that it is highly valued to present messages in a pleasant, almost cute way that do not make people uncomfortable. Is it possible to achieve radical changes without making people uncomfortable? And another question, is discomfort a profitable terrain for change? And how do you approach this issue in a society that is more and more oriented towards the idea of comfort?
All right, so after I wrote Sexual Politics of Meat, I did a book called Living Among Meat Eaters. It's just come out in a new edition, and at the end of December. What I found in writing that book was that, well, actually, after it was published, is I hear from people still who read it every year because it gave them a handle on how to respond to interpersonal aggression. Mm-hmm. So I would distinguish between when we're making an argument and when we're having an interpersonal experience. I actually do not think in terms of interpersonal experiences that being in your face works. And what's interesting is that when the book first came out, which was 2001, some of these men who go on to either protect the men who were sexual exploiters or were the men who were sexual exploiters, we were all at the same conference. And I talked about You know, you don't actually have to answer all the questions meat eaters ask you. You know, you can refuse to do that. And you can refuse to be their entertainment. And, you know, they interrupted me and they said, well, we feel we have to speak for the animals and we never leave anybody. We always have to make our mark, as it were. And now, you know, 20 years later, several of them were saying, oh, we tried that didn't work. You know, this is why we're going into clean meat. This is why we're doing that. And I thought, yeah, they can't admit that perhaps they were wrong in 2001 and 2002. But my basic argument was that meat eaters ask us questions not because they care, but because we've made them defensive, and their response is going to be to make us defensive. So I want to put in I want to just bracket interpersonal relationships are perhaps not the place to be angry. When I was writing Sexual Politics of Meat, probably in 1988 or something, I thought, boy, am I angry. You know, this is going to be a screed. I must remove my anger, because the job of an author is not to ask people to handle my anger, but to get people to feel their own anger. And so I tried to be angry in a different way in my analysis, instead of in my in an emotive language that would offend some people. And I think that worked, because what happens is I hear from people who say, you know, I felt my consciousness changing reading your book. Well, good. I wasn't asking them to join my consciousness. I was asking them to be in a process. Now, how do we get people to be in the process? Publishing books like Ocho Dos Cuatro is a way to help people reach consciousness. Showing my slideshow is an attempt to help people reach consciousness. Interviews, conversations. Here, I think we cannot help but talk about issues that are going to be upsetting. Our veganism is not just a boycott, but it is a boycott. And we want people to understand why we're boycotting a terribly cruel, inhumane system. How we get them to go vegan is a different thing. How we get them, you know, some people immediately became vegan when they read Sexual Politics of Meat, and others, you know, there was one feminist who told another feminist, I'm not going to read that because I might have to become vegetarian. And I thought, what kind of feminist theorist do you avoid because it might change you? But so in 2021, I participated in a debate at Oxford University on I was one of the people defending the motion that this house should go vegan, or should, you know, stop eating meat or whatever. And I thought, this is going to be a nice way for me to have a nice 10-minute summation of my perspective. And so I will go to England and participate. I didn't even know who the opponents were. I started looking them up, and my son, who's much more savvy than I, you know, kept saying, you should look at who this Mikhaila Peterson is. And sorry, Ben, I didn't listen to you. So when I got there, I had a couple friends, Christopher Sebastian, who you perhaps know his work, amazing Black vegan activist, just profoundly insightful, and Helen McGregor, an Oxford resident, a novelist, a vegan activist. So we go to this dinner, first of all, and we're waiting to get in. The Oxford Union is its own closed-in space. It's a whole property. It's like a block long. And we're waiting outside the gate, and people are just streaming out. I think, I wonder what that was. Well, it was a talk by Jordan Peterson, who is a right-wing, controversial, conservative Canadian, believes men represent order and women disorder. And they had invited him to speak at 5. His daughter, Mikhaila, was against the motion. She had created something she called the Lion Diet, which of course isn't a lion diet. It's red meat. It's four-legged animals. So we're at this dinner, and the professor, a professor of philosophy from Oxford, is also defending the motion, and we're sitting at the head table. So it's the professor of philosophy, me. Here is the president of the Oxford Union, and to his right was Jordan Peterson, and across from him was Michaela, and they had served to them as an appetizer a huge piece of what we call steak, mammal flesh. Mm-hmm. And so I simply turned to him and said, well, you must have had an interesting, interesting conversations about what people were eating tonight. And he said, yes, they had specified very, very explicitly the weight of what they wanted for their appetizer and how well it should be cooked. And we noticed that both of them sent away part of their appetizer. And then the meal came. And the meal for them was, again, a flesh from a mammal, a four-legged mammal. And once again, neither of them finished it, even though they explicitly named how much they wanted. So I can send it to you. I had the philosophy professor pretend to take a picture of me so that I could get a picture of all this meat that they were wasting. I mean, if they're going to claim they need to eat dead animals, why not at least be responsible? Okay, I've gotten a little sidetracked. Mm-hmm. Then we go to the debate. Mm-hmm. And in my presentation, I talk about white supremacy, I talk about misogyny, climate change. I try to cover everything that I can in 10 minutes. And because it was Jordan Peterson's daughter, and Jordan Peterson was there, and he apparently has quite a social media following. So in January, he went on the Joe Rogan show, January of last year, which he's a controversial podcaster who had just gone and joined one of the music streaming things. And he was already controversial because he had aired some anti-vaccination beliefs. And Jordan Peterson went on and talked about hearing this most woke presentation, such a terrible example. And then he talked about me and how unhappy I must be and how nobody must love me. I must not be in a relationship. I mean, wow. Just all this speculation. And this got the Oxford Union very excited because I could see on LinkedIn that they referred to this. And immediately they released the video, which Peterson then posted and said, the most woke talk you'll ever hear. Mm. And that set all of his followers to go to the Oxford Union website, YouTube website, and watch the show, which then resulted in so much hostility. And if you look at it, it's ageist, it's misogynist, they can't get over the idea that I would suggest that white supremacy had anything to do with meat eating. And they're flummoxed, and they're also very, very crude. And the emails I got, I sent them all to my publisher, were just shocking. You'd not even you'd have to blank out almost every word that came. Very very ableist too. Mm-hmm. So you talk about all of this is the question, how do we reach people? Well, here I thought I was, giving a nice summation of my perspective. And out there in the world are so many people who still just believe the most craven, right-wing, elemental things that, that there is a gender binary, that they are men, that they must defend this, that they must attack the person speaking. I never saw them as my audience. Yeah. But they decided they were my audience. And that I think is representative of something that's happening in the United States. I think it's happening in other places, this sort of leaning towards towards anti-democratic principles, fascism. There's a new book that just came out today that's talking about the beliefs of the right wing. I mean, it's frightening. Of course, the right wing is going to believe in the sexual politics of meat. It fits perfectly. And am I trying to reach them? No, but I am trying to reach progressives about, if you care about democracy, if you care about misogyny, if you care about ending white supremacy, here are the reasons you should be including animals in your analysis. We did that as a book called Protest Kitchen. You might want to bring that one out in Spanish, because we really just do a chapter that shows how this is connected to climate change, and then we give suggestions on how to, for instance, how to move to plant milk. If you really care about democracy and are anti-racist, here are the concerns, and then would have recipes and stuff. So that was our attempt to reach progressives, but I don't know if progressives, want to extend. Not all progressives appear to want to include an analysis of the beings on the other side of the species barrier in their thoughts. Originally, we wanted to call it the anti-Trump diet, but in 2017, most publishers did not think Trump would be around for long. So our book was, it's the first time that optimism hurt my book projects.
Yeah, and I think this example, we could also read the comments in your YouTube video about this intervention organized by the Oxford Union. And I think maybe this is also related with this anti-feminist discourse of the extreme right that is proliferating a lot in virtual spaces, right? And there's authors that call it the machosphere, even like, all the power they have, the hate they spread in the virtual sphere. So yeah, that's horrible.
You wonder about the psychological makeup and neediness of people who live that way. The fear and suspicion, and Jordan Peterson speculated about me, but I'll tell you, first of all, he looked really sick. He deathly sick, but I don't know that I want to speculate, but when I think about all of these people reacting, they're so close-minded, and you realize that to follow leaders who breed hate is really a sign of such insecurity, and that so many of the people are men. The role of white men, especially in the attempt to really overthrow the United States government on January 6, 2021. It's always been said that since the feminist movement of the 70s, there have been downwardly mobile men because of capitalism and the changing nature of work in the United States. And these downwardly mobile men became anti-abortionists, they become right-wing, so we aren't that far from a feminist intervention in society to finding out that white men don't want to lose their power. I have always believed that great vegan meals are one of our best assets. And I, in Living Among Meat Eaters, that's what I propose. Have a great vegan meal, have meat eaters over. Don't ever say it's vegan. I think for activists, one of our difficulties is recognizing the role of incubation. As a writer, I incubated these ideas. They didn't all come together. I mean, it took me 14, 15 years. I was incubating for a long time. But we think that, you know, once we say to someone, well, you should be a vegan, look what's happening to animals, that they're immediately going to hear us. Well, there's one theory, just a footnote here, that when people hear facts in our voice, when they recall them, they're going to hear our voice. But what we want them to hear is their voice. So in these kind of things where we think confrontation is going to help, what we're leaving them with is our role as superego in their lives. And that's the last thing most people want, is another kind of person assuming control over what they know, how they know it, what they should do. That's what we're rebelling against as adults, is the superegos of our childhood. So have a great vegan meal. Don't tell people that it's vegan. Don't remind them. And then they go home and they think, God, that was a good meal. Oh, Carol's a vegan. God, that was a good vegan meal. And, you know, then they ask for the recipe. I make this vegan ricotta, which is just, 16 ounces of tofu and 4 ounces of a good vegan cream cheese and some olive oil and lemon and a little salt and garlic powder. I cannot tell you the number of meat eaters who can't stop eating it. They ask me for the recipe, they make the recipe, they serve the recipe over and over again. It's such a simple thing, and yet it's vegan ricotta. And if one person that I have over becomes vegan, and then they do vegan meals, and those people, and then they have 2 people who become vegan. I mean, we're talking about numbers again. There is growth through this. It's not the only thing. I'm not trying to depoliticize our activism. We've got it. Yesterday, there was a protest in front of banks in the US by people my age about climate change. We have to do all of it, but let's do great vegan meals and not push it in people's face.
Yeah.
How do we show this is normal and ordinary if we're always talking about it? Let's make it normal and ordinary. Let's, even in the 70s when I lived in Cambridge, there were a lot, one of my roommates was at Radcliffe, which now is part of Harvard, but we had a whole bunch of the international students who were stuck at Harvard over the Thanksgiving break, which is in November for the US. And so we had what we called a vegetarian propaganda meal. And we just did, huge amounts of vegetarian food without ever talking about it. I think this is where propaganda is really good, because it's not really propaganda. We are just giving comfort. There's nothing like vegan comfort food. And, now we have lots of recipe books for vegan comfort food. People think you can't veganize their comfort food. But I'm still waiting to find something that can't get veganized. This year at Christmas time, I did vegan popovers, which is, a British thing. They turned out great. So comfort, they talk about afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, but we also want to comfort everybody. We are living in such terrible times, such frightening times, and anxiety-producing times. Let's have a little grace in everything we do. Not everything we want is going to happen today. We're all testimony to that. And I also think our activism should never be inspired by the idea that we have to make a difference. We want to make a difference, and we hope to make a difference. But whether we do or not is beyond our control. We're doing this because it's what we believe in. That should be comfort too. We are not always going to be able to measure our impact, but that we did it is what matters.
That's certainly inspiring. Yeah, because sometimes it's very difficult to deal with the emotions of, the scale of the suffering.
The frustration.
And, this is back to, at least in the United States, these messaging, this single issue messaging, oh, you know, you must see all these films. If the animals experience it, you must see it. No, why? Why do you have to traumatize yourself more? Don't believe that. And no, you don't have to be doing something for animals every single day, every single minute of every day of your life. You need to recharge. You know, with caregiving, they talk about you're like a pitcher, and once you've emptied out the pitcher, you've got to refill it. You can't go on caregiving when your pitcher is empty, when the pitcher is, you know, this kind of pitcher, not picture. And the same thing is true for activism. We can't believe that our actions are so consequential, egocentrically speaking, that we deny ourselves the self-care we need. It just makes us more fragile. We need to be robust. I mean, we are in this for decades. And once you reorient yourself to that, even though we're all also impatient, you can give yourself a little grace and, you know, read a mystery, go biking, take in a rescue dog, walk with them, you know, all of those things. Make good vegan food for yourself, back to comfort food.
Yeah, I completely agree. And at the same time, yeah, I have been thinking about the work of discomfort, because now I think we are talking more about animal advocates, feminists, and people who is already struggling to kind of propose this change we want to see in the world. But then there's also, I think, a lot of numbness. I don't know if I think the word is numbness, yes. So sometimes the discomfort can be like an emotion that make people want to rethink and reconnect with their own deep beliefs and values. I don't know, what do you think that's also, that can also be true?
Well, I think, you know, in the United States, discomfort is often called guilt.
Okay.
And I think for some meat eaters, what they've done is accepted that they're going to feel guilty. Yeah. And what they do is deprive themselves of the idea that guilt is actually telling you something. If you feel guilty about something, ask yourself, why am I feeling guilty? Oh, I could change, but change is too hard. So I'm going to choose guilt instead. Yes. I think discomfort, you know, while it may express itself as guilt, discomfort, like many emotions, we aren't educated about our emotions, and we stuff them down, and we wait till discomfort becomes anger, and then in a sort of male-oriented world, we know what anger does. Anger gives you permission to, you know, bring it out, externalize it. And so all these sort of smaller or less, I don't know what the word would be, not smaller, but they're less loud. Anger is a loud emotion. It kind of takes over you, just like grief. Those are loud. We'll just for today call them loud emotions. But these emotions that are perhaps a little less loud, discomfort. Well, what is that? How can I get rid of it? And we stuff them down till they explode out as anger, and then we get it out, and then we go through the same pattern again. So we need some sort of more emotional maturity or education to know discomfort is a message. You know, avoiding grief is a message. To choose guilt instead of grief, I'd rather feel guilty than feel grief. I think meat eaters, non-vegans, especially around dairy, I think dairy is a very difficult issue for people because they know it's wrong. But to know it's, you know, well, two things. One is people will say, don't tell me. And it's kind of like, if I don't have to tell you, what do you already know? Yes. Or
so don't show me, right? Regarding the images and the videos. It's right. Like, I don't want to see, because I know if I watch this video or the moral shock experience, I would change my behavior. I would need to think about it, right? No,
I would need to think about it, and I don't want to feel these feelings. And so I think often non-vegans are looking at us and they're trying to figure out, has veganism improved our lives? And if they see us as angry, or they see us as unhappy because we were ending up at another meal where all there is lettuce or whatever. I mean, these are some of the messages of living among meat eaters. What they're seeing is we aren't happy in our veganism. So they'd rather be unhappy eating a hamburger than unhappy in veganism. So first of all, I think it's important for us to be happy in our veganism and to do what we have to do to be happy in our veganism. But secondly, I think we need to help people see that grief is going to be a part of our lives.
Yes.
To be aware of what animals are going through, for instance, around dairy and cows and the veal calves, the whole thing, it is unconscionable, it's immoral. And of course we grieve. And what I want non-vegans to see is the grief doesn't destroy us. The grief is going to be with us, but we know how to live with it. There it is. Hi, grief. Here you are again. I've been reminded. I saw this ad, or I saw, on this busy highway in Dallas, there was this truck just filled with chickens. It so upset me. Well, here you are again, grief. You're familiar. And I've learned how to incorporate you into my life. And one of the best things I think we can do is help people who feel discomfort know that these emotions can be worked with. Yes, you're going to feel grief. It's not going to destroy you. You're going to have some vegan ricotta. You're going to find a way through this. So let's talk about the pornography of meat.
Yes.
I'm grateful for you for publishing it. And so what happened after Sexual Politics of Meat appeared, there were only two images really related to proving the sexual politics of meat. One was what I would call an animalized woman, cut up on the cover. And then the other was the feminized or sexualized animal at the beginning of chapter 2. But all that was needed was people just started sending me images. And when the images arrived, I'd look at it and think, and then, and then I'd think, well, how does this reflect the current status of sexual politics of meat? And from that, I started creating this Sexual Politics of Meat slideshow, but I had to keep incorporating things. I'd see how race was working. When were Black women shown animalized? Well, what was particular about that? I got so much around feminized animals and cows. And in Europe, there's trucks that are carrying pigs to slaughter, and they're showing these sexualized beings on the back, like, yes, come and get me. And that's back to discomfort. You're going to be discomforted thinking about the animals who are alive in that truck. But then you look at the back, oh no, they want it. They're happy about it because that's what the image communicates. So I did the pornography of meat in 2003, but a lot has happened since then. And a lot of theory has evolved, our understanding of the gender binary. So I wanted to update it and kind of try to have a final word, because really working with these images, even though they're so illustrative of an oppressive culture, to be the person who gets these images from around the world is a little overwhelming. So I wanted it to be a thing that could be shared with other people, so that what could be recognized is that something that you think might just be, England or Scotland, Spain, France, the United States, Canada, has moved all around the world. So in Pornography of Meat, I wanted to highlight how the gender binary needs the sexual politics of meat, and how the sexual politics of meat reinforces the gender binary, this kind of homosocial behavior that is connected with meat eating, but then sort of escapes being seen as homosocial. How the realm of this masculinity and meat eating is operating now, with the gender binary being so threatened. So the first part of the book is looking at that. I wanted to show how pernicious and persistent this is. No, the sexual politics of meat isn't about something from 1990, even though when I finished that book, I thought, wow, now that I've finished it, is the world changing? There's my optimism. So I felt that was important in and of itself. I wanted to incorporate my work on a book called Burger, where I really looked at colonialism and the importation of cows to the land we now know as North America, how that influenced the oppression of Native Americans, the elimination of the buffalo. All of that is tied into how colonialism and white supremacy is tied into meat eating. I wanted to have that more thoroughly discussed and understood. And then I wanted to spend time explicitly describing what's going on with feminized protein taken from living animals, cows, and chickens, and show the extreme ways that desire is imputed to animals. And this is what's so interesting, is that we live in a world that's saying we, animal advocates, are anthropomorphizing animals. We're saying animals don't want to die, or animals, have feelings. But what's so interesting is that all of these ads anthropomorphize animals. Our world denies animals have feelings, but through the sexual politics of meat and the pornography of meat, the implication is that once they're dead, animals desire to be consumed. The only desire animals are supposed to have is the desire for us to consume them. It's like the cover, eat me. That, and again, you've got this sort of hybrid, the animalized woman, or so I feel the book is an intervention to help equip people to look at the day-to-day, the quotidian, the naturalized images of our world, and see how they are constantly working to reinforce these attitudes, especially about women and animals, but also about the gender binary, and to uphold white supremacy. So I felt that it was really important to update the book so that it could be speaking to us really in the 21st century. So that's the pornography of meat. I gave over the last chapter to feminist artists, that they could have the last word instead of me, which I really thought was liberating, have them, because the book is about representation. So let the representation move forward. And so that's my, yes, what we're looking at is depressing. Yes, there's a fixation on sexuality. Yes, there's a denial that we are exploiting the sexuality of non-human animals, but we have resistance, and we can trust artists to help us resist these images too.
Now, after this great presentation of the book, I think we would like to know a bit more about your, what are your plans, and what are you looking forward to? We read the article in the New York Times about your opinion article, yes, about Jane Austen's Guide to Alzheimer's, and we found it very touching and important. So yeah, I personally loved how you talk about this support that you found in the literature to cope, especially with a complex moment in your life, no? In terms of an emotionally demanding care situation. So would you like to tell us a bit more about this project and this experience, or whatever your thoughts on that?
So in 2002, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I have two sisters, and the three of us would fly in to help provide care. She died in 2009. And during that time, I started reading Jane Austen. I had never read Jane Austen. So here I am in my 50s reading Jane Austen. And suddenly Emma just was so entertaining and wonderful. At first, I just talk about repetitive behavior. I listened to it every day. I just couldn't get enough of it. And then I realized that Mr. Woodhouse must have Alzheimer's. And this was so revolutionary to me. And so the same path that I followed about feminism and vegetarianism when I had that idea in 1974, kind of this light bulb, or for me, I feel like I levitate above the ground for a minute. I'm just lifted off by this idea. And in 74, that idea was feminism and vegetarianism. And about 2007, it was, oh, Mr. Woodhouse has Alzheimer's. And suddenly the book like exploded. And I started to track, well, how do I prove that? And what are the signs? And meanwhile, I'm using it to kind of help me as succor and support. So in 2015, I wrote about it for the New York Times, and they gave it the very nice title, Jane Austen's Guide to Alzheimer's. And I heard from so many people who just felt like, well, this finally explains why I've always liked Emma. And, this helps so much. And since that time, I've been trying to finish a book. Now, Sexual Politics of Meat took 15 years. And if you date this from when I had the idea, 2006, 2007, where are we? So are we at 13? No, yeah, 18? I can't even do math anymore. So it's taking a while. It's emotional. Yes. How do you write it? It's the same question about tone. And I get angry at the critics who don't get it. So just like I got angry at meat eaters, now I get angry at critics. And I always kept a journal, or since 1995, I've kept a journal, and I've tried to use my journal to help remind me of what I felt and use that to kind of talk about Emma's inner life as a caregiver. But in the middle of trying to write it, of course, came the Me Too movement and revising Pornography of Meat, which took months and months more than I expected. And then we also revised Ecofeminism with a new edition. And then because I simply apparently don't know how to say no, and because this was such an important social justice issue, we did this book, The Good It Promises, the Harm It Does. It just came out in February from Oxford University Press. Critical essays on effective altruism, which I see as a really, really dangerous approach to thought, to funding, to animals. And so Jane Austen just keeps getting put to the side as I think I'm doing one more collection, and then I hope I stop fiddling or editing other people. Not that I don't love everything I have edited and everything people have said. It's just remarkable. I think editing reminds us that we're all in a collective process. It's not singular. But I'm doing a collection on vegan cycling and sort of the subjectivity of vegan cycling. And we're calling it Peddling the Resistance. Which is, in sort of a double entendre. So I think figuring out how to handle my time demands continues to be my biggest struggle. But I hope to finish the Jane Austen's Guide to Alzheimer's, or whatever it'll be called, this year.
To read it and to check on your new books and collections, editions. Yeah, I think this one you mentioned about effective altruism would be really, really interesting and important, not only like in the US, but also here and other contexts, I guess.
It's really a deadly approach. And so we have this sort of stories and essays from a variety of people. Christopher Sebastian, Brenda Sanders about community organizing. I talk about Rational Economic Man. We have critiques of effective altruism by philosophers. A great essay on effective altruism and the reified mind. So I think it's feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonialist work in its way, because effective altruism perpetuates the status quo.
And almost to finish, we would like to know what anti-speciesist readings have you enjoyed lately, and what groups, conflicts, or campaigns have particularly interested you because of their approach, message, subject matter in the recent years, more or less.
I mean, I hate to leave anything out. I would say that a lot of my work this year was the anti-speciesist writing in here.
Yes.
And working on that. So I have to, I'm not trying to be self-referential, but to refer to the writers here. I think there are some groups, I perhaps am not as internationally involved as you might think I am. In terms of groups, I distrust groups affiliated with effective altruism, whether they're here in the United States or elsewhere. I'm very distrustful of those. I think Pro-Veg is effective altruism in Europe, and distrusted as a result. I distrust animal charities evaluators in the United States. I support sanctuaries. Effective altruism, recommends against supporting sanctuaries. There's intersectional sanctuaries like Vine, which is a LGBTQ anti-racist sanctuary. I support some other sanctuaries as well. I support Food Empowerment Project, which just does incredible work. We Animals, the work of Joanne MacArthur, the internationally, photographer. It's so remarkable with her project, which has expanded so much in the past few years. I think, and the Culture in Animals Foundation, I think we have to recognize the role of culture, the role of images, the role of art. I try to always support artists if they reach out and say that my work impacted them, to, participate with them in a conversation or something. I think anti-dairy campaigns are very important, and there's often an anti-dairy campaign tied to Mother's Day. I also always do, there's a bailout, a Black mamas bailout for Mother's Day here in the United States, of getting Black mamas out of jail by Mother's Day, which I feel is essential to support. I think I'm often behind the scenes in activisms, because people will call me and say, well, I've been on, what should we do about that? What should we do about this? So I try to be available to help with those things. So I'm sorry, it's a little nebulous. I'm not trying to be nebulous.
No, it's perfect. Great answer. Okay, one more question and we will let you go. As we talked about before, there's this response, this hate, this criticism that part of your work have received, but not positive or constructive criticism, but these insults and hate. How have you handled it? And more generally, where do you get the strength to continue with activism?
Well, I remember the first negative review of Sexual Politics of Meat. It was a full-page negative review by the novelist Aubrey Renoir in a British Sunday paper. And I read it and I thought, my God, if he had gotten the book, I would be worried. What a relief he didn't get it. I mean, he was clearly so conservative and did not understand basic feminist principles. So that became sort of liberatory. I'd say of the reviews that came in, at first, 80% were negative. And around the world, Australia and Israel and all. It's like, what a crazy idea. But they spent so long arguing with me. I thought, well, that's a good sign. So of course the right wing isn't going to get it. I should be worried if the right wing does get it. better to hear from someone who used to be in the right wing and say, boy, I read your book and I realized, I was on the wrong path or something. So being an anti-racist activist in the 80s and going through some very, very difficult times of being really personally hated by my neighbors, I think that is what equipped me to be the author of The Sexual Politics of Meat. My anti-racism work of the 70s did not just help me understand how interconnected oppressions work. It helped me be the author, become a person who could handle being hated. When I was first hated as an anti-racist activist, I was shocked. I thought, I'm a nice person. I want to be liked, but I'm not going to change my position here. So I learned that this comes along with being an advocate. So by the time Sexual Politics of Meat came out, and this person, Rush Limbaugh, who sort of preceded Jordan Peterson as a right-wing monologuist, spewer of hatred. When he hated Sexual Politics of Meat, I thought, well, he doesn't know where I live. Go ahead and hate Sexual Politics of Meat. You're not my neighbor. You're not going to personally threaten me. So then I could just enjoy it and laugh about it. Certainly, I think the discourse has gotten cruder. I think it therefore proves the point more. I become my own illustration of my point. So how do I handle that? Well, I listen to mysteries. I bike. I go for walks with Inky. I have a partner who's loving. We've been together for 42 years. 43, 43. Well, how many is it? 44, something like that. And there's a lot of love in my life. I love biking and seeing a heron and seeing an egret. And, I'll call out to them, hi, heron. It's so great to see you today, to see bunnies. And just to be reminded we live in this world that's more than us. And sometimes you need to cry. Crying's very healing. They actually think your tears have some chemical that's very healing. So, as in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet cries for 30 minutes and somebody says, one of the critics says, 30 minutes is just right. An hour would have been too long and 15 minutes would have been too short. Well, I don't have 30 minutes, so I'll cry 15 minutes and then, go on. So there's stuff worth crying about too. But then get some vegan ricotta on a piece of toast and, get on your bike and go say hi to the herons. So self-talk that keeps me from feeling more important than I am, but also not less important than I am.
Wow, that's a powerful lesson. Thank you for sharing all your thoughts and all your experience with us today. We are very grateful